The courthouse had seen hundreds of cases like this before. On the outside, it was just another gray morning in a mid-sized American city, traffic humming past brick buildings, flags hanging stiff in the cold air. Inside courtroom 3B, the atmosphere was stiff and predictable. Wooden benches creaked as people settled in. Lawyers whispered to one another. A clerk organized files with practiced indifference. This was supposed to be quick, routine, just another child welfare hearing in a long list of them. No one expected anything memorable to happen. Near the front of the courtroom, a uniformed police officer stood quietly beside his K9 partner. The dog, a large German shepherd with a disciplined posture, lay on the floor with his paws neatly aligned. His badge number was stitched onto the harness he wore, clean, official, and familiar to anyone who worked in law enforcement. He had been trained for chaos, gunfire, shouting crowds, night raids. A courtroom, by comparison, was easy, silent, controlled, predictable. The dog hadn't moved since entering the room. The judge adjusted her glasses and flipped through paperwork, already planning how to move the docket along efficiently. She handled dozens of cases involving young children removed from unsafe homes. Most followed the same pattern: limited testimony, formal language, careful decisions. Emotional, yes, but rarely surprising. Then the door opened. A social worker stepped inside first, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Holding her hand was a small girl, no more than 3 years old. She wore an oversized sweater that swallowed her thin arms and shoes that were slightly too big for her feet. Her dark hair was uneven, as if someone had cut it quickly without care. She clutched a small stuffed rabbit so tightly its fabric was worn thin. The child paused just inside the doorway. At first, it seemed like nerves. Courtrooms were intimidating even for adults, but this hesitation was different. Her eyes scanned the room slowly, carefully, as though she were searching for something she couldn't quite name. The adults barely noticed. The judge glanced up briefly, then back down. One attorney cleared his throat. The bailiff shifted his weight. To everyone else, the girl was just another case file made flesh. Tragic, yes, but not unusual. The police dog noticed her immediately. His ears twitched before his handler even registered her presence. The movement was subtle, barely noticeable, but trained eyes would have caught it. The dog's breathing changed, not faster, not slower, just alert, as though a switch had been flipped somewhere deep inside him. The handler felt it through the leash, a slight tension, a readiness. He frowned. The dog had been exposed to countless people, defendants, victims, witnesses, children, adults. He never reacted like this, especially not without a command. The handler glanced down, silently reinforcing a stay command with his posture alone. The dog remained lying down, but his eyes followed the child. The social worker guided the girl forward. With each step, the child's grip on the rabbit tightened. Her shoulders rose toward her ears. She wasn't crying. She wasn't speaking. But her body told a different story. Something inside her was waking up. When they reached the bench near the front, the social worker knelt and whispered reassuring words. The girl nodded slightly, though it was unclear if she understood. Then she stopped moving. Her gaze locked across the room, straight onto the police dog. Her face changed. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was recognition, confusion layered with something deeper. Her lips parted slightly and her breathing hitched just once. She tilted her head as if trying to fit a memory into place. The dog slowly raised his head. The handler's heart skipped. This wasn't trained behavior. This wasn't random distraction. The dog's eyes were fixed on the girl with intense focus, pupils slightly widened. His tail remained still, but his muscles tightened beneath his fur. The handler felt it now, clear as day. Something was wrong. The judge began speaking, unaware of the silent exchange unfolding. Her voice echoed calmly through the courtroom as she summarized the case. Words like custody, placement, temporary guardianship floated through the air. The child didn't hear any of it. She took a small step forward. The social worker gently tried to pull her back, thinking the child was restless. But the girl resisted, not forcefully, just enough to show intention. Her eyes never left the dog. The courtroom felt different now, quieter, heavier. Even those who hadn't noticed the dog's reaction felt something shift. A strange tension settled over the room, like the moment before a storm. The dog let out a soft sound, not a bark, not a growl, a low, almost questioning whine. The handler's breath caught. In all his years working with this K9, he had never heard that sound in a controlled environment. That sound didn't come from training. It came from instinct. The judge paused mid-sentence. Her eyes lifted from the papers. "What's going on?" she asked. No one answered. Because at that exact moment, the little girl lifted her arm. Her small finger extended, steady, deliberate. She pointed straight at the police dog. The room went completely still. No coughs, no shuffling, no whispered side conversations. Time seemed to freeze in that simple, impossible gesture. A 3-year-old, barely verbal, had singled out a police K9 in a crowded courtroom with absolute certainty. The handler tightened his grip on the leash. The dog stood up. Gasps rippled through the room. The judge rose slightly from her seat, instinctively alert. The bailiff moved one step forward. Attorneys stared, stunned. This was not supposed to happen. This was not part of any procedure. The child didn't flinch. She just stared at the dog, eyes wide, chest rising and falling fast. Something from her past, buried, wordless, powerful, had just broken through the surface. And no one in that courtroom yet understood what it meant. But they were about to. The sound of the police dog standing echoed louder than it should have. It wasn't dramatic, no barking, no lunging, but the scrape of his paws against the courtroom floor sliced through the silence. Every eye snapped toward him. The handler felt his pulse spike as instinct kicked in. His hand tightened on the leash, his posture stiffened, and his voice dropped into the calm, commanding tone the dog had been trained to obey without question. "Sit." The command was soft, controlled, absolute. The dog didn't move. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Police dogs were known for discipline bordering on perfection. Disobedience, especially in a courtroom, was nearly unheard of. The handler repeated the command, this time firmer, his jaw clenched. "Sit." The dog shifted his weight but remained standing. His eyes never left the little girl. The handler swallowed hard. This wasn't defiance. This was something else entirely. The dog's body language told a story the handler knew too well: heightened alertness, protective focus, restrained urgency. It was the posture the dog took when he believed someone was in danger. But this was a courtroom, and the only thing different was a child. The judge rose fully from her seat now. Her voice, though steady, carried a sharp edge. "Officer," she said, "is there a problem?" The handler hesitated. Years of experience told him not to dismiss what his partner was signaling, but procedure demanded control. "No, Your Honor," he said carefully. "My dog appears distracted." Distracted was an understatement. The little girl still hadn't lowered her arm. Her finger remained pointed at the dog, trembling slightly now. Her face had gone pale, her mouth pressed into a thin line. She wasn't crying, but her breathing had become shallow, uneven. The stuffed rabbit dangled forgotten from her other hand. The social worker knelt beside her again, whispering soothing words, trying to guide her arm down. The girl resisted, shaking her head once. A soft sound escaped her throat, not a word but something close. The dog whined again. Louder this time. Several people gasped. One of the attorneys instinctively stepped back. The bailiff moved closer to the handler, hand hovering near his belt, not out of fear but protocol. The handler felt torn in two directions. Everything he knew about law enforcement said regain control. Everything he knew about this dog, his instincts, his reliability, said listen. Your Honor, the handler said slowly, choosing his words with care. He's never behaved like this before. The judge studied the scene, the rigid dog, the frozen child, the anxious adults circling them. She had spent decades reading people. She trusted patterns. And this didn't fit any she recognized. Clear the room, she said suddenly. We're taking a recess now. The command snapped everyone into motion. Spectators were ushered out first, confusion written across their faces. Lawyers gathered files hastily. Court staff whispered urgently as they moved. Within minutes, the courtroom was nearly empty, leaving only essential personnel behind. The child was guided to a bench near the wall. She finally lowered her arm, though her eyes never left the dog. Her small body shook now, the delayed release of tension finally arriving. The handler knelt beside his K9, placing a steady hand on his back. Easy, he murmured, not as a command but reassurance. The dog remained standing, but his breathing slowed slightly. His tail flicked once, low and controlled. The judge descended from the bench and approached them. Up close, she could see the fine details, the dog's focused stare, the child's pale face, the way both seemed locked in a silent exchange no one else could hear. How long have you worked with this dog? She asked. 5 years, the handler replied. He's been deployed in high-risk situations, crowds, violence. He's never broken command like this. The judge glanced at the child. And you believe this reaction is what? The handler hesitated. Admitting uncertainty in court was never ideal, but lying would be worse. Instinct, he said finally. Strong instinct. Across the room, the child advocate watched closely. Something tugged at her memory, an old case, a late-night call, paperwork she'd nearly forgotten. She stepped forward. Your Honor, she said carefully, this child was recovered during a police response several months ago. The handler's head snapped up. The advocate continued. There was a domestic disturbance. The child was missing when officers arrived. A K9 unit assisted in the search. The air in the room shifted again. The handler's stomach dropped. What date? He asked quietly. The advocate checked her tablet. October, early morning, Eastside Apartments. The handler closed his eyes briefly. He remembered. The night had been cold, the apartment dark, shattered glass on the floor. The child hadn't cried, hadn't made a sound. His dog had picked up her scent near the laundry area. When they found her, she was curled up behind a washing machine, shaking silently. He remembered how his dog hadn't barked. How he'd lowered himself to the floor instead, slowly, gently, until the child had reached out and touched his fur. How she'd leaned into him, clinging like he was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become terrifying. That was us, the handler said hoarsely. That was my dog. The judge looked back at the child, then at the dog. The connection, once invisible, now felt unmistakable. She remembers him, the advocate said softly, not with words but with feeling. The dog finally sat down slowly, deliberately, but he did not relax. His body remained angled toward the girl, watchful. The child, sensing the shift, took a small step forward on her own. No one stopped her. She reached out hesitantly. The handler tensed, but the dog stayed perfectly still. Her fingers brushed the edge of his fur. She let out a shaky breath, and then, for the first time that day, she smiled. Not a big smile, just a small one, but it transformed her face. The judge exhaled slowly. This court, she said, voice steady but moved, has just witnessed something extraordinary. She paused, looking around the nearly empty room. And we are not done yet. Courtroom remained closed longer than expected. Outside the heavy wooden doors, people whispered in the hallway, lawyers, clerks, officers. all sensing that something unusual was unfolding inside. Inside, the air felt thick, almost sacred, as if no one wanted to disturb the fragile moment that had formed between a police dog and a little girl who should never have remembered him. The child sat on the bench now, feet dangling above the floor. She held her stuffed rabbit loosely, her grip no longer desperate. Her eyes moved between the adults cautiously, but always returned to the dog. The K9 lay down again, though his body stayed angled toward her. He was calm now, but alert in a way that felt deliberate, protective. The handler had loosened his hold on the leash, trusting his partner's instincts more than any command he could give. The judge returned to her seat, but did not resume the hearing. Instead, she watched. Years on the bench had taught her that truth did not always arrive through testimony or evidence. Sometimes it arrived quietly, unexpectedly, through behavior that could not be rehearsed. "Bring in the child psychologist," she ordered. Within minutes, Dr. Elaine Carter entered the courtroom. She had reviewed the child's file before but had not expected to be called into a situation like this. Her eyes moved from the judge to the child, then to the dog. She paused. "That's him," the handler said softly, following her gaze. Dr. Carter approached slowly and crouched to the child's level. "Hi," she said gently. "Do you know this dog?" The girl didn't answer with words. She pointed again, but this time not sharply, gently. Her finger touched the air just above the dog's head. Dr. Carter nodded. "That's okay, you don't have to talk." She turned to the judge. "Children this young don't form narrative memory the way adults do. They don't remember events in sequence, but they remember sensations, safety, fear, comfort." She looked back at the dog, especially if those sensations were intense. The handler felt a weight settle in his chest. He remembered the apartment that night, the shouting, the broken door, the silence afterward that felt even louder. He remembered thinking they were too late. And then the dog had pulled toward the laundry room. He remembered his partner lowering himself to the floor, blocking the chaos behind him, creating a barrier between the child and the rest of the world. He remembered how the girl had crawled out slowly, fingers clenching the dog's fur like an anchor. "She didn't cry," the handler said quietly. "She didn't make a sound, not even when we lifted her." Dr. Carter nodded. Children who experience severe trauma sometimes go silent. Their nervous system shuts down. The judge folded her hands. "And the dog?" Dr. Carter smiled faintly. "Dogs are exceptional at reading emotional states, police dogs especially. They associate scents, voices, postures, but also emotional memory. If this dog experienced that moment as protective, purposeful, it stayed with him." The handler looked down at his partner. The dog's ears twitched, as if he understood his name being spoken even without hearing it. Across the room, the child advocate flipped through records again. "There's more," she said. After that night, the child was moved through 3 temporary placements. Each reported severe anxiety, sleep disturbances, withdrawal. The judge frowned. "And now?" The advocate glanced toward the child. "She's calmer than she's ever been in court." As if on cue, the girl slid off the bench and took a step forward. Everyone tensed. But she didn't run. She didn't panic. She walked slowly, carefully, until she was standing just a few feet from the dog. She crouched. The dog didn't move. She reached out and placed her small hand on his shoulder. The handler held his breath. The dog exhaled deeply, his body relaxing just enough to show relief. His tail thumped once against the floor. It was the sound of recognition. Dr. Carter's eyes filled with tears. "This," she said softly, "is regulation. Her nervous system is responding to a familiar source of safety." The judge leaned back in her chair, shaken. This case was no longer procedural. It was human. And animal. "And now?" the judge asked. Dr. Carter hesitated. Now we ask whether removing that source of safety again would cause harm." The words landed heavily. The handler felt a sudden, unfamiliar fear, not for the child, but for the dog. He had never imagined his partner becoming part of a legal question. "Your Honor," the handler said carefully, "with respect, my dog is an active-duty K9. He can't." "I know," the judge interrupted gently. "No one is suggesting otherwise." She paused, then added, "But the court must consider what is in the best interest of the child." The girl leaned closer to the dog now, resting her head briefly against his side. Her shoulders dropped. For the first time since entering the courtroom, her body looked at rest. A silence settled over the room, one filled not with tension, but with awe. The bailiff, who had seen decades of cases, wiped his eyes discreetly. The judge cleared her throat. "I am ordering a full review of this child's initial rescue," she said, "including K9 involvement. I want all reports, all footage, everything." She looked directly at the handler. "Officer, your dog may have just become a key witness." The handler nodded slowly. That night, the one he had filed away as just another call, was no longer finished telling its story. And neither was this case. Because whatever happened next would change not only the child's future, but the meaning of what a police dog could be. And deep down, everyone in that courtroom felt it. The hardest part was still ahead. The courtroom felt different after the judge's order. What had started as a routine hearing was now something else entirely. The air carried an unspoken understanding that the past, long ignored and neatly filed away, was about to be dragged back into the light. The judge dismissed the remaining proceedings for the day and ordered everyone to reconvene once the full records from the child's rescue were reviewed. As people began to leave, the handler remained seated, one hand resting lightly on his K9's back. The dog stayed close to the girl, not touching her now, but positioned so she could see him at all times. She didn't cry when she was led away. That alone was unprecedented. Later that afternoon, in a quiet office down the hall, the investigation began. The judge, the child advocate, Dr. Carter, and two senior officers gathered around a table stacked with reports, photographs, and timestamps. Surveillance footage flickered on a monitor, frozen on a grainy image of a dim apartment hallway. The handler stood near the door, arms crossed, his jaw tight. "I remember the call," one of the officers said. "Domestic disturbance, neighbors reported screaming, then silence." Dr. Carter leaned forward. "How long before you arrived?" 6 minutes, the officer replied. "But by the time we forced entry, whoever caused it was gone." The handler's eyes stayed on the screen. The footage resumed. The video showed officers moving cautiously through the apartment, furniture overturned, a lamp shattered, a dark stain on the carpet that no one wanted to name out loud. Then the dog appeared on screen, nose to the floor, tail rigid, pulling slightly ahead of his handler. "He stopped barking," the handler said quietly. "That's when I knew it was a child." Everyone turned toward him. "When dogs bark, it's alert," he continued. "When they go silent, it's protection." The footage showed the dog leading them to the laundry area. The camera shook slightly as the officer crouched. The image froze again, this time on a small shape curled behind a washing machine. The girl, barefoot, dirty, completely still. Dr. Carter covered her mouth. The handler remembered the moment vividly. The way his dog lowered himself slowly, carefully, as if afraid to frighten her. The way the child's eyes followed him, unblinking. The way she reached out not for a human, but for the dog. "She trusted him instantly," the handler said. "Didn't trust us, just him." The judge watched the footage in silence. "What happened after?" she asked. The child advocate flipped through the file. The suspect was never located. The mother was hospitalized. The child was removed and placed into emergency care. "And the dog?" the judge asked. The handler swallowed. He was praised. Then we moved on to the next call. No one spoke, because now it was painfully clear. The moment that defined everything for the child had been nothing more than a footnote in the system. That night hadn't stayed buried for her. It had waited. The following morning, the courtroom reconvened. This time, the gallery was full. Word had spread quietly among courthouse staff. Something unusual was happening. Reporters waited outside, unaware of the details but sensing a story. The judge allowed the K-9 to remain. When the dog entered, the child, sitting with her advocate, noticed immediately. Her shoulders relaxed. Her feet stopped swinging nervously. She leaned slightly toward him, as if gravity itself had shifted. Dr. Carter observed closely. "This is consistent," she whispered to the advocate. "The dog functions as a stabilizing anchor." The judge called the hearing to order. New evidence was presented: psychological evaluations, Foster reports, behavioral logs. A pattern emerged. Every placement without the dog resulted in regression. Night terrors, silence, withdrawal. But today the child sat quietly, eyes alert, calm. Then something unexpected happened. One of the attorneys, attempting to move proceedings forward, stood abruptly and raised his voice slightly. Not shouting, just firm, assertive. The child flinched. Instantly the dog's head snapped up. His body tensed, ears pinned back, not toward the attorney but toward the child. He shifted closer to her, placing himself between her and the sound. The handler felt it through the leash. "That," Dr. Carter said softly, "is protective memory." The judge slammed her gavel lightly, not in anger but awareness. "Enough," she said. "Lower your voice." The room obeyed. The child looked up at the dog, eyes wide. He didn't touch her. He didn't move closer. He just stayed. And that was enough. The judge leaned forward. "This court recognizes that this animal's presence has had a measurable impact on the child's emotional state." Murmurs rippled through the room. She continued, "We are now facing a serious question. Did the system fail this child by separating her from the one source of safety she identified?" The handler's chest tightened. This was no longer about memory. It was about responsibility. Later that afternoon, the handler sat alone in the K-9 unit room. His dog lay at his feet, exhausted but peaceful. "You did your job," the handler murmured, "even when we didn't know it." The dog lifted his head, eyes soft. That night the handler dreamed of the apartment again, but this time the child wasn't hiding. She was standing, holding the dog's fur, unafraid. The past was no longer content to stay silent. And tomorrow, the court would have to decide how far it was willing to go to make things right. Because the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. That police dog hadn't just rescued a child. He had saved her. And she had never forgotten. By the third day, the courthouse no longer felt quiet. News vans lined the street outside, their satellite dishes angled toward the sky like curious eyes. Reporters spoke in hushed tones, careful not to draw attention, yet unable to hide their anticipation. Something unusual was happening inside courtroom 3B, and everyone could feel it. Inside, the mood was tense. The judge took her seat with measured calm, though her eyes showed the weight of the decision ahead. The child sat beside her advocate, legs tucked beneath her, stuffed rabbit held loosely in one hand. Across the room, the police dog lay beside his handler, alert but calm. The moment the child saw him, her shoulders eased. Dr. Carter watched closely, clipboard resting against her knee. Over the past 2 days, she had recorded everything: the child's breathing patterns, eye movements, posture changes. The data was undeniable. The dog's presence regulated the child in ways no therapy session ever had. But not everyone was convinced. A representative from Child Protective Services stood and cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he began, "while this bond is compelling, we must remember that police animals are not emotional support tools. They are working assets. Setting a precedent like this." "I'm aware of precedent," the judge said calmly. "I'm also aware of harm." The room went quiet. The CPS representative continued, choosing his words carefully. "Our concern is long-term dependency. Removing the dog later could re-traumatize the child." Dr. Carter stood. "Respectfully," she said, "the trauma already occurred. The dependency did not form because of the dog's presence, it formed because of his absence." That landed hard. The handler felt his jaw tighten. He'd spent his career enforcing rules, respecting systems, but listening now, he couldn't ignore the truth forming in front of him. The child shifted when voices rose. Immediately, the dog lifted his head. The handler noticed before anyone else. He gently shortened the leash, not to restrain but to reassure. The dog settled, eyes never leaving the child. The judge noticed too. "Let the record reflect," she said, "that the K9 responded to the child's distress before any verbal cue." The CPS representative sat down. During a break, the handler stepped into the hallway for air. A fellow officer leaned against the wall beside him. "Never seen anything like this," the officer said quietly. "Me neither," the handler replied. Across the hall, the child advocate knelt in front of the girl, showing her pictures on a tablet, animals, toys, familiar places. The girl barely reacted until an image of a police dog appeared. She smiled. That image would later appear on the evening news, blurred, anonymized, but unmistakable. By afternoon, public interest exploded. Social media lit up with speculation. Commentators debated ethics, law, and emotion. Some called it heartwarming, others called it dangerous. Inside the courtroom, none of that mattered. What mattered was the child. The judge requested testimony from foster caregivers. One by one, they described the same pattern: nightmares, refusal to speak, panic at raised voices. "Did any placement attempt include familiar comfort objects?" the judge asked. "Yes," one caregiver said. "Blankets, toys, music." "And did any work?" "No." Dr. Carter stood again. "Because none of those objects were present during the trauma," she said gently. "The dog was." The room stilled. The handler looked down at his partner, his chest tight with pride and fear. Fear, because this wasn't just about recognition anymore. It was about consequence. That evening, the handler sat alone in his car, engine off, staring at the steering wheel. He thought about the job, about retirement age, about policies. He thought about the night he and his dog had found a silent child in the dark, and how that moment had never truly ended. Inside the courthouse, the judge reviewed case law late into the night. There was nothing like this. No clear path. No instruction manual for justice when it collided with instinct. She slept poorly. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. The judge called everyone to order. "I will be clear," she said. "This court is not considering removing a police dog from service." The handler exhaled. "But," she continued, "this court is considering whether temporary, controlled contact with this animal is in the best interest of the child." Gasps rippled through the room. The handler's breath caught. The CPS representative stood again. "Your Honor." "I'm not finished," the judge said firmly. "This is not sentiment, this is evidence." She gestured to Dr. Carter. Dr. Carter approached the stand. "Based on my professional evaluation," she said, "continued supervised interaction with the K9 may significantly aid the child's recovery and reduce long-term psychological damage." The judge nodded. She looked at the handler. "Officer, would your unit be able to accommodate limited, supervised visits?" The handler hesitated, just a fraction of a second. "Yes," he said, "if approved." The dog shifted at his feet, tail tapping softly once. The child looked up at the sound. Their eyes met. Not fear. Not confusion. Recognition. As if she understood, somehow, that something important had just changed. The judge banged the gavel lightly. "This court will recess while I draft a temporary order." The room erupted into whispers. As everyone stood, the child did something unexpected. She let go of her rabbit. She walked slowly toward the dog. No one stopped her. She knelt and rested her head briefly against his side. The dog stayed perfectly still. And for the first time since anyone could remember, the child laughed. A soft, breathy sound. But real. The handler felt his eyes burn. Outside, cameras flashed. Inside, something fragile but powerful had begun to heal. And tomorrow, the world would learn that sometimes justice didn't come from law books. It came on 4 legs. The temporary court order was signed just before noon. It was careful, precise, written in language that tried almost desperately to control something emotional with structure and rules. Supervised contact only, limited duration, designated location, no public exposure, no media presence. On paper, it looked manageable. In reality, it changed everything. The handler read the order twice, his brow furrowed. He had testified in court countless times, followed procedures without question, trusted the system even when it was flawed. But this was different. This wasn't about arrest protocols or evidence handling. This was about responsibility, shared between a police officer, a court, and a small child who had already lost too much. His K-9 partner sat beside him, calm as ever, unaware that his life had just shifted in a way no training manual had prepared him for. The first supervised visit was scheduled for the following morning. It would take place in a neutral setting, a child advocacy center across town, soft lighting, calm colors, no uniforms, no sirens. The handler would wear plain clothes. The dog's harness would be replaced with a simple collar. Everything was designed to remove pressure. Still, the handler barely slept that night. He kept thinking about what could go wrong. What if the child became too attached? What if removing the dog afterward caused more harm? What if this wasn't healing, but delaying pain? At dawn, he took the dog for a long walk, letting him set the pace. The dog moved confidently, tail relaxed, senses alert but peaceful. To him, this was just another day with his person. To everyone else, it was a test. At the advocacy center, Dr. Carter reviewed the plan one final time with the supervising staff. Her voice was calm, but tension sat beneath it. She understood the stakes better than anyone. "This is not about creating dependence," she said. "It's about restoring a sense of safety, then transferring it gradually." The child arrived shortly after, holding her advocate's hand. She looked around cautiously. When the door opened and the dog entered, without uniform, without authority, her face lit up. Not excitement. Relief. She smiled and took a step forward without hesitation. The handler stopped several feet away and unclipped the leash, just as instructed. The dog walked forward slowly, head low, movements gentle. He stopped short of the child and sat. He waited. The child approached and reached out, placing both hands on his shoulders. Her breathing slowed. Dr. Carter watched the monitors closely. Heart rate, muscle tension, everything shifted into a calmer range within seconds. "This is remarkable," one staff member whispered. For 30 minutes, the visit went exactly as hoped. The child played quietly nearby while the dog lay close, occasionally lifting his head to watch her. She spoke a few soft words, simple ones, but words nonetheless. It was more progress than months of therapy. Then the unexpected happened. A door down the hall slammed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, but it was sudden. The child froze. Her body stiffened instantly, her eyes widened, her hands dropped to her sides. Before anyone could react, she let out a sharp cry and backed away, stumbling. The handler moved instinctively, but stopped himself mid-step, remembering the rules. The dog didn't hesitate. He rose and stepped between the child and the sound, placing his body squarely in front of her. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply stood, blocking. The child collapsed to the floor behind him, clutching the back of his collar, shaking. The handler's heart slammed against his ribs. Dr. Carter raised her hand. "No one move," she said calmly. The dog remained steady, muscles tense but controlled. His ears were forward now, eyes scanning, assessing. Every instinct screamed protection, but years of training kept him grounded. The child pressed her face into his fur. And slowly, agonizingly slowly, her breathing steadied. Minutes passed. When the danger had clearly passed, the dog eased himself down to the floor, still between her and the hallway. Only then did the handler kneel beside them. The room was silent. Dr. Carter exhaled. That, she said softly, was the trauma response. She turned to the staff. And that, she added, nodding toward the dog, was regulation. But not everyone saw it that way. Later that afternoon, CPS filed an urgent concern. The argument was sharp and immediate. The dog had acted independently, without handler command. The child had clung to him in distress. This, they claimed, was proof of emotional reliance becoming dangerous. By evening, the judge was reviewing emergency motions. The handler sat in his living room, the dog's head resting on his foot, while his phone buzzed with updates he didn't want to read. He felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff. Had he made a mistake agreeing to this? The next morning, the courtroom was tense. No cameras this time, just silence. The CPS representative spoke first. "Your Honor, yesterday's incident demonstrates exactly what we feared. The child panicked, and the dog became her sole coping mechanism." Dr. Carter stood immediately. With respect, that panic would have occurred regardless. The difference is that this time, the child did not spiral. The judge looked toward the handler. "Officer, did your dog disobey any commands?" "No," the handler said firmly. "He responded to perceived threat, remained controlled, and de-escalated without aggression." The judge nodded slowly. She turned toward the child, who sat quietly with her advocate, eyes drifting toward the dog lying at his handler's feet. Calm, present, alive in the moment. "This court must decide," the judge said, "whether we are witnessing harm or healing in progress." She paused. "Sometimes," she continued, "recovery doesn't look neat." The room held its breath. The judge leaned forward. "The temporary order stands." The handler exhaled. "But," she added, "we proceed with caution." That afternoon, as they prepared to leave, the child did something no one expected. She walked up to the handler. She looked up at him. And she spoke. "D'Auguste." 2 words. Clear. The handler felt his throat tighten. He knelt and met her eyes. "He's not going anywhere," he said softly. The dog's tail thumped once. The test hadn't ended. But for the first time, hope felt stronger than fear. And that mattered. The night before the final hearing, the city felt unusually quiet. Inside her chambers, the judge sat alone, surrounded by case files spread across her desk. She had read them all, every report, every evaluation, every legal brief. Still, something kept her awake. This case refused to settle neatly into the categories she had relied on her entire career. Because this case wasn't just about a child. It was about what happened when the system missed something important, and whether it had the courage to admit it. Across town, the handler lay awake too. His dog slept on the floor beside the bed, breathing slow and steady, unaware of how much rested on the coming day. The handler stared at the ceiling, replaying moments over and over. The child's trembling finger pointing in court, the dog stepping forward without command, the quiet laughter during the visit. He knew tomorrow could end it all. If the judge ruled against continued contact, the dog would return to duty as if nothing had happened, and the child would be asked, once again, to let go of the one thing her body still trusted. At dawn, a call came that no one expected. The child's advocate was the first to receive it. An investigator from the original domestic violence case had come forward overnight, retired now. He'd seen the coverage, recognized the details, and realized something had never sat right with him. He had information. By the time court convened, the atmosphere was electric. Everyone sensed this was the end. The child sat quietly beside her advocate, legs swinging gently. She clutched her rabbit again, not tightly this time, just enough to feel it. The police dog lay beside his handler, calm, steady, eyes half-lidded but alert. The judge entered and took her seat. "We are here," she said, "to determine whether the temporary order will become a structured therapeutic arrangement, or whether it will end today." No one spoke. "Before we proceed," she continued, "new testimony has been requested." A murmur spread through the room. The retired investigator was sworn in. His hair was gray now, his posture slower, but his voice was clear. "I was part of the response team the night this child was found," he said, "and there's something the record never reflected." The judge leaned forward. "The suspect wasn't just gone," he continued. "He was hiding." The room stilled. "I found signs later that suggested he had been inside the apartment during the search, possibly watching. But the K9 moved in a way that blocked access. The dog positioned himself between the child and the doorway." The handler's chest tightened. "That dog," the investigator said firmly, "may have prevented a second assault." Gasps echoed softly through the courtroom. The CPS representative shifted uncomfortably. The investigator continued, "We didn't know it at the time, but looking back, that dog didn't just find her, he shielded her." Dr. Carter closed her eyes briefly. The judge's voice was steady but heavy. "Why wasn't this documented?" The investigator swallowed. "Because we couldn't prove it, and because sometimes things get lost when everyone's focused on moving forward." Silence. The child shifted in her seat. The dog lifted his head. Dr. Carter stood slowly. "If this is true," she said, "then the dog is not just associated with safety. He is associated with survival." The judge looked down at the child. The child looked back at the dog. Then something extraordinary happened. The child stood. She walked toward the center of the courtroom, slowly, deliberately. No one stopped her. She reached the dog and placed her hand on his back. Then she turned. And she pointed, not at the dog this time, but toward the doorway behind them. Her face tightened. She shook her head once. Dr. Carter felt her breath catch. "She's communicating," she whispered. The child's advocate knelt beside her. "Can you show us?" she asked gently. The child hid behind the dog, pressing into his side. The message was unmistakable. The courtroom understood without a single word spoken. The dog shifted slightly, placing himself fully between the child and the open space. Exactly as he had that night. The judge closed her eyes. Years on the bench had prepared her for lies, manipulation, anger, fear. But not this. She opened her eyes again. "This court recognizes," she said slowly, "that this animal did more than perform a duty." She paused. He became a constant in a moment where everything else was chaos. The CPS representative stood, voice tight. "Your Honor, even with this new information, we must consider long-term implications." "And we will," the judge said firmly, "but not at the cost of erasing what happened." She looked at the handler. "Officer, has your dog ever shown inappropriate aggression?" "Never," the handler replied. "Has he ever failed to respond to command?" "No." She nodded. Then she turned to Dr. Carter. "Doctor, is continued supervised contact medically advisable?" "Yes," Dr. Carter said without hesitation. "It could change the trajectory of this child's life." The judge exhaled slowly. The courtroom waited. "This is not an easy decision," she said, "but justice rarely is." She lifted the gavel. "And this court will not ignore what is right in front of it." The child leaned into the dog. The dog stayed still. The judge raised the gavel again. "What I decide next," she said, "will be remembered." And in that moment, every person in that room knew. They were witnessing something that would never be undone. The courtroom was silent in a way that felt almost sacred. Everyone, judge, attorneys, advocates, officers, and staff, knew that today's decision would shape the child's future, the dog's role, and somehow their own understanding of what justice could mean. The little girl sat beside her advocate, legs dangling above the floor, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. The dog lay quietly at his handler's side, alert but still, tail tapping once every few seconds. Their bond was undeniable, visible in the smallest gestures, a glance, a tilt of the head, the tiniest shift in posture. The judge tapped the gavel lightly. "This court has reviewed all evidence, including new testimony, psychological reports, and observations of the child's interactions with the K9. After careful consideration, this court has reached a decision." The words hung in the air. The child looked up at the dog. He returned her gaze, calm, unwavering. "This court finds," the judge continued, "that supervised, structured contact between the child and the K9 unit is not only beneficial but essential to her continued emotional development and safety." Murmurs spread across the room. Some nodded in agreement, others seemed unsure, but no one dared interrupt. The child's eyes widened. She reached out, barely daring to hope. The dog shifted slightly, as if sensing her expectation. The judge continued, her voice steady but compassionate. "The officer and his K9 partner are authorized to participate in a therapeutic program designed to support the child's recovery. The visits will be scheduled, supervised by licensed professionals, and documented to ensure her safety and well-being." A quiet gasp escaped from the child's advocate. Dr. Carter smiled, her eyes glistening. The CPS representative lowered his head, resigned. Even he had to acknowledge that this was the right decision. The judge leaned forward. "This is not a replacement for therapy, foster care, or human guidance. It is an acknowledgement that, in certain circumstances, bonds of trust, especially those formed in life-or-death situations, cannot be ignored." The courtroom was still. Then slowly the little girl slid off her chair. She moved forward cautiously, eyes locked on the dog. The handler knelt slightly, ready to intervene if necessary, but he had learned over the past week that intervention wasn't needed. The girl reached the dog and pressed her small face against his neck. Her tiny hands clutched the soft fur. She whispered something the room couldn't hear, but the dog responded with a soft exhale, a gentle nudge with his nose. A hush fell over everyone present. Witnessing this was unlike any courtroom drama anyone had ever seen. The judge's gavel tapped lightly again, almost unnecessary now. "Let the record show," she said, "that this child's emotional welfare has been considered in full, and that her bond with this K9 is recognized as a crucial part of her recovery." As the hearing concluded, the child's advocate helped her stand, but the girl didn't move far. She stayed close to the dog, her tiny hand resting lightly on his back. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited, cameras poised. But this moment wasn't for the press. It was private, intimate, sacred. The handler opened the door and the girl slipped into his side, leading her gently out of the courtroom. The dog followed, calm, steady, eyes never leaving the child. In the hall, Dr. Carter watched quietly. She knew that therapy would continue, but this bond had already healed things words could not reach. Weeks passed. The child adjusted to the routine visits. Each session began with nervous anticipation, but she soon learned that the dog's presence was steady, predictable, and comforting. Her laughter returned slowly, her voice grew stronger, and her sleep became deeper. The handler, too, noticed changes, not just in the child, but in himself. In years of service, he had seen danger, chaos, and fear. But he had never witnessed a bond like this, a silent understanding between a tiny human and a trained canine that could speak louder than words. One afternoon, after a particularly successful session, the child knelt beside the dog and whispered something in his ear. The dog tilted his head, wagged his tail, and rested his chin on her shoulder. She giggled, a clear, bright sound that echoed through the therapy room. The handler smiled, holding back tears. He had never expected a case to change him this way. Months later, the judge received an update. The child had stabilized emotionally. Reports described improved speech, fewer nightmares, and even attempts at social interaction with other children. The dog's presence was cited as a significant factor in her recovery. The judge allowed herself a small smile. Justice, she realized, wasn't always about punishment or legal precedent. Sometimes it was about recognizing truth and protecting what mattered most. On the last supervised visit before the summer break, the child knelt beside the dog one final time in the therapy room. She looked up at the handler, then whispered, "Thank you." The dog's tail tapped softly against the floor. The handler knelt and hugged the girl gently, careful not to disturb the bond between her and his partner. As they walked out of the room, the little girl glanced over her shoulder at the dog one last time. She waved. He didn't move, except for the soft lift of his ears, a subtle acknowledgement that the connection was never broken. Later at the K9 unit, the handler brushed his dog's fur while reminiscing about the first time they had found the child. "You saved her," he murmured. "And you saved me too." The dog rested his head on the handler's knee. No words were needed. The memory of that night, the fear, the silence, the trust, was theirs alone. In the end, the child continued to grow, steady and confident. She never forgot the dog who had been her anchor in darkness. The handler continued his service, proud of his partner and the small human whose life they had both saved. And the dog? He returned to duty, calm and professional, but forever carrying the memory of a tiny girl who had pointed at him in a courtroom, and reminded everyone that some bonds transcend fear, words, and even time. Years later, the story circulated quietly among law enforcement, therapists, and courthouse staff, a legend of instinct, courage, and compassion. Not because of fame, but because it proved a simple truth. Sometimes, real heroes come with 4 legs, and a heart brave enough to protect even when no one else notices. The little girl never forgot. And the dog never stopped watching over her. Some goodbyes, after all, are never really goodbyes.